All right. Chapter 21 continued, part B. And I don't know if you guys can hear my kids blasting Disney soundtracks in the background. Not distracting at all for me. Okay, so last time we talked about Hardy Weinberg. So again, Hardy Weinberg says, look, a population isn't going to evolve if it's established genetic equilibrium. Right? So in other words, if allele frequencies are not changing, then it's not evolving. However, it will evolve and genetic equilibrium will not be achieved. In other words, allele frequencies will change if one or more of the principles, the 5 principles on this slide, are occurring. Okay, and so, are not occurring actually, sorry. All right, so this slide kind of summarizes that. So if the conditions for Hardy-Weinberg are met, then evolution doesn't occur. But if one or more of them are not met, then evolution is happening. And if evolution is happening in a population, then we need to try to figure out which one or one's multiple mechanisms are causing the evolutionary changes. All right, and so this table kind of summarizes where we're headed for the next couple of minutes. So on the left-hand column, you can see the 5 mechanisms. And if you remember, there were 5 principles of Hardy-Weinberg. So each of these 5 mechanisms, or agents as they're called in the table, violate one of the Hardy-Weinberg principles. So if any one of these 5 are happening, then the population is evolving because Hardy-Weinberg is not being met. And if it's evolving, then genetic equilibrium is not being achieved, and therefore allele frequencies are changing. All right, so the first one is mutation. So you know what a mutation is, just any heritable change in DNA. And so this could be a single change to a nucleotide base. It could be sections of a gene flipping or duplicating or getting deleted, or sections moving from one chromosome to another. Lots of different examples of mutation. But the end result of mutations is that they fall into one of 3 categories: lethal, neutral, or advantageous. So these should be pretty self-explanatory. So some mutations are lethal. So you change the DNA, which changes the RNA, which changes the amino acid sequence, which changes the protein. And if that protein doesn't function or doesn't function in a way that's beneficial, it can even function in a way that kills the organism. So some mutations are lethal. Some mutations are neutral. So you might change a nucleotide base pair, say from an A to a C, but because of the redundancy of the genetic code, that might mean that you ultimately code for the same amino acids, so you end up making the same protein. So some mutations happen, but they don't actually affect anything. They don't really change the protein, so therefore they're not lethal and they're not advantageous, so we call them neutral. Some mutations are advantageous, so they change the protein in a way that ends up benefiting the organism. So I don't know, maybe it changes the feather color so they're more camouflaged, or maybe it creates, I don't know, also it could do anything that would provide a benefit to the organism. Those would be advantageous. So how do mutations violate Hardy-Weinberg? Well, that should be pretty obvious because Hardy-Weinberg said no mutations are occurring. That was principle number 1. So if mutations are occurring, then it's going to violate this one and evolution is going to happen. So, and the reason for that is, again, Hardy-Weinberg is saying that allele frequencies aren't changing, but if a mutation leads to a new allele, or basically a mutation is creating new information, so a mutation is going to change the allele frequencies and violate Hardy-Weinberg. All right, the second one is gene flow. So gene flow is simply when organisms or gametes, or especially the alleles that they have, move from one population to another. So how would an allele move from one population to another? Well, it could be carried on gametes. So you might be a tree and you produce pollen, and that pollen has alleles, and that pollen goes from one population to another and fertilizes another plant there. And so those alleles have been carried from one population to another. Or it could be, like you can see in the picture, an entire organism moves. So here we've got a blue jay. It's picked up an acorn, and it flies from one oak grove to another in the forest. So it's moved that oak tree, that baby oak tree, from one population to another, and it carries its alleles in that acorn. And so in this case, the receiving population is going to get new alleles from that new oak tree, or in the previous example, it's going to get different or new alleles from the pollen. And in either case, it's going to affect the allele frequency. So gene flow violates Hardy-Weinberg by violating number 2, population is closed to migration. So because we have immigration of new individuals or new alleles to a population, it's going to change the allele frequency and violate Hardy-Weinberg 2. So anytime gametes or individuals move from one population to another, then technically that population is evolving. All right, and then the bullet point I missed here, sometimes gene flow counters evolution. So this is because, let's go back to the acorn example. Let's say that the population of oak trees that's going to ultimately receive the acorn, let's say that microevolution is happening in a direction where maybe natural selection is causing the oak trees to have larger root systems. All right, but this acorn that moves in, it's got alleles that create a smaller root system, and so the new alleles can actually kind of slow down speciation and can actually work against what natural selection is doing. The third example is genetic drift. So genetic drift is when chance events sometimes cause allele frequencies in a population to change unpredictably. So genetic drift is completely random, and as you'll see in a minute, it's much more pronounced in small populations. All right, and we'll talk about the 2 types in just a minute, but let's look at this figure. So this figure represents our initial population. So the gene pool is represented by this jar, vase, whatever this is, bottle. And each of the marbles represents a different allele that's available. So you can just eyeball it and see that the red alleles are fairly rare, and that the blue and the green alleles are approximately 50-50. All right, and then a chance event happens. So a fire burns through the forest, or there's a flood or an asteroid strike or something that isn't natural selection. It's just this random environmental event. And what ends up happening is this population gets reduced in size. So the ones that stay in the jar, these are alleles that get killed. And the surviving population is much smaller, as you can see here. And the alleles that survive are random. In other words, surviving this catastrophe isn't based on fitness. It's not based on what alleles are present. It's just based on luck. And so the ones that survived happen to carry mostly blue alleles and a few green alleles. So here we've had a big shift in the allele frequency from green and blue approximately approximately equal with a few red ones thrown in the mix. And our new population is mostly blue, with the green allele becoming rare, and the red allele got eliminated entirely. So this population has evolved from here to here through genetic drift, just through chance changes. All right, and how does this violate Hardy-Weinberg? Let's go back. So the population has to be infinitely large for chance occurrences to not change allele frequencies. And so here we have a finite population both in the beginning and in the end. So this chance event has caused allele frequencies to change. And by the way, it doesn't have to be an event. It could just be, if you remember from meiosis, in meiosis you have crossing over, so you've got this shuffling that takes place in sexual reproduction that's going to just basically randomly move genes around, and then whatever sperm fertilizes the egg is completely random. So you can just have just calculating probabilities. It could be that your allele frequencies shift over time just due to the chance occurrences of particular alleles getting passed on, because those were the gametes that happened to be fertilized, whereas other alleles become less frequent because the gametes that carried those less frequent alleles just happen to not undergo fertilization. There's 2 types of genetic drift: population bottlenecks and the founder effect. And so this is actually an example of a population bottleneck. So here, that's why they drew it as a bottle, by the way. So you've got all of these different alleles represented, but your survivors get bottlenecked, creating a smaller population. So that's one example of genetic drift. The other is the founder effect. So let's go to the example from the book, which is in the Amish. So you get these Amish populations that have settled in places like Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. And so they initially came from Europe with a large population, lots of alleles represented, and then a small subset of them moved to North America and settled in Pennsylvania. And so just by chance, just by genetic drift, the ones that founded the new Amish population had less genetic diversity and happened to have a syndrome, a disease called Ellis Van Creveld syndrome. And so this is a syndrome that we find in Amish populations, and it's simply because that population was founded by a relatively small group, and they just happened by chance to bring some of the alleles that lead to this syndrome. There's another syndrome that causes someone to have an extra finger, which is what's going on in this picture. He's got 6 fingers, count them. Not just 6 fingers on his right hand, like in The Princess Bride. He's got 6 fingers on both hands. So that's similar to what's going on in the Amish population. So these are both syndromes that we see in certain populations that were founded by a random but fairly small group of individuals. All right, natural selection. Hopefully you know a little bit about natural selection from the last lecture. So natural selection is basically, let's see, where is it in the textbook? Is it not? Natural selection is the process by which successful traits become more common in subsequent generations. So natural selection just means that in a population there's a diversity of genes available and alleles available. And the alleles that lead to a phenotype that is good at gathering resources and surviving and finding a mate and having offspring, that phenotype is going to be selected for. In other words, it's going to have more babies, and those alleles that are beneficial are going to spread to the next generation and ultimately spread throughout the population. Conversely, natural selection will select against phenotypes that have alleles that make them not as competitive or can't have as many mates or not as many successful offspring. So to me, the easiest example is to think of cheetahs. So if there's an allele that causes cheetahs to be a little bit faster, then those cheetahs are going to catch more prey and they're going to eat more food, so they're probably not going to starve to death, and they're going to have more mates because they're healthy and they can get food, and they're going to have more offspring because they have more calories available. So natural selection is basically causing the cheetahs to become faster by selecting for those alleles. And if there's an allele that causes cheetahs to be a little bit slower, then natural selection is going to select against that allele, and those cheetahs will die. And when they die, or they're going to reproduce less frequently, and when those things happen, those alleles get removed from the gene pool. Sometimes we track reproductive success through something called relative fitness. So relative fitness is just the number of surviving offspring that an individual produces compared to the number of surviving offspring by others in the population. So the fast cheetahs are going to have a higher relative fitness than the slow cheetahs. So in other words, it's just a metric for kind of measuring an individual or an organism's ability to survive, reproduce, and have offspring. How does natural selection violate Hardy-Weinberg? Let's go back. So number 4, all genotypes survive and reproduce equally. That's required for genetic equilibrium to be established and for allele frequencies to not change. But if natural selection is causing some genotypes and phenotypes to survive and reproduce more when it's selecting for them because they have higher fitness, and at the same time, if natural selection is selecting against genotypes that don't survive and reproduce as well, then it's violating Hardy-Weinberg. So anytime natural selection is in play, then it's going to violate Hardy-Weinberg principle number 4, and therefore the population will be evolving. We can split natural selection into 3 types, 3 examples. So here they are side by side. Those types of natural selection are directional selection, stabilizing selection, and disruptive selection. So the example from the book is imagine tail length in birds. So let's say that the tail length is going to be, the females are looking for a particular tail length, and if the males have that particular tail length, they're more likely to get mates, and they're more likely to reproduce and have more offspring. So in directional selection, it shifts the characteristic in a particular direction. So these yellow sections under this bell-shaped curve are tail lengths that natural selection does not favor. So our initial population has a nice bell-shaped curve. So the majority of the birds have a tail length clustered around the median or the mean of about 10 centimeters, and some have shorter tails and some have longer tails. And in directional selection, the females are mating with the males that have shorter tails less frequently. So the males with shorter tails get selected against. So what's going to be the result of that? The males with longer tails are going to have higher fitness, and they're going to mate more frequently and have more offspring, so those alleles are going to get passed on. So over time, in directional selection, your bell-shaped curve is going to shift. In this case, it's shifting to longer tails, so it's shifting to the right. Right? So directional selection causes a population to evolve. In this case, it's causing it to evolve in a particular direction by moving the tails, the average tail length from a shorter length to a longer length. The second example is stabilizing selection. Here, short tails and long tails are both selected against. So perhaps the females prefer a medium length tail, or perhaps females prefer a longer tail, but if your tail gets too long, then you don't fly as well and you get eaten. There could be multiple things going on here. But the point is, natural selection removes the short-tailed and the long-tailed alleles, and so your bell-shaped curve becomes less bell-like and becomes more skyscraper-like. So the population has evolved in the sense that it's been stabilized by natural selection. The rarer alleles have been removed, and so more of the individuals are going to cluster around the mean. In disruptive selection, it's the opposite of stabilizing selection. Here, maybe some females like shorter tails and other females like longer tails, but having an average tail isn't as attractive. So here, natural selection selects against the individuals that have a tail that's clustered around the mean. And so what's going to happen is your population is going to split into two. You're going to get individuals that have shorter tails and individuals that have longer tails, but you're going to have fewer individuals that are at the mean. Another example of disruptive selection is with the finches that we keep talking about. So in the beginning, they had beak lengths of various lengths, and it turns out that for some of them, having a small beak was better for getting resources, and some of them having a large beak was better for getting resources. So the population splits into the small beaked and the large beaked finches in a similar way to this example where the population splits into short-tailed and long-tailed birds. So again, just three different subtypes or examples of natural selection in action. There's the finch example I was talking about. So again, the medium or average bill sizes got selected against, and the population split into small bills and large bills. And you can see especially how disruptive selection will cause speciation over time. So initially you had one population, right, that had beaks or tails or whatever, and it looks like this, but at the end, or as a consequence of disruptive selection, the population splits into two. And so over time, these two aspects of the population might even become new species. Let me go back to this. I skipped this earlier. So this is showing human birth weight. And so this is representing the average birth weight of a human baby, right? So you can see that this links to the percentage of the population. So you can see that about 20% of the population gives birth to a human baby that weighs around 7 pounds. And fewer people give birth to a baby below about 5.5 pounds. And a smaller percentage of the population gives birth to babies that are larger than 8.5 pounds. So why is that? Why does the human population give birth to babies that are around 7 pounds? Well, if you look at mortality, you can see that mortality, this links with this axis, mortality is higher when babies are born small, and that's because they're not developed enough. And mortality increases when babies are born weighing a lot, and that's because the birth process becomes more dangerous. So here we find that the majority, or the most babies are born here at the middle range, because that's where mortality is lowest. So what type of natural selection is this? Is it directional or stabilizing or disruptive? Good job. This is an example of stabilizing selection. Great job. All right, sexual selection is another type of natural selection. So in sexual selection, um, let's see, in sexual selection, there are traits that are selected for, not necessarily because they help the organism survive, but because it helps them find mates. So traits that benefit finding a mate and having mating success are going to be selected for, and traits that don't help mating success are selected against. All right, and so an example of this is, let's look at this picture. Here we've got, what the heck are those things? Deer? Oh my gosh, I'm a biology professor and I'm not even sure. So let's go with, they look kind of the elk. Oh gosh, this is so embarrassing. Let's say that they're, let's just say they're deer. All right, and if you're familiar with white-tailed deer, you know that male deer have antlers and females do not. So what's up with that? Well, the males fight over access to mate with females. And so the males have basically weapons growing out of their head. So the antlers help the males fight. And the winner of the fight has access to the females and the loser does not. So the winner of the fight has better reproductive success. So sexual selection has selected for males that have antlers and males that have larger sets of antlers because it helps them fight better. And at the same time, sexual selection is selected against males that don't have antlers or have smaller antlers. So sexual selection has created a phenotypic difference between males and females. So males fighting over females is an example of intrasexual selection. Here the selection is happening as the males fight each other. So in intrasexual selection, you have selection based on the interactions between members of the same sex. So guess what intersexual selection is? That's right. It's when you have selection based on the interactions between males and females. So in intersexual selection, oftentimes you have males producing structures that maybe don't help them fight other males, but basically just the ladies like those characteristics. So the example here, this is a bird of paradise, and so this is the male. He's pretty freaky looking. This is the female, and so having these colors, and he also does a mating dance. This helps him have better reproductive success, and he's doing this for the benefit of the ladies. The ladies are selecting males based on their feathers and their dancing and so on and so forth. So this would be an example of intersexual selection. So when sexual selection creates differences in males and females, this is called sexual dimorphism. So in a lot of different in a lot of different animal species, there are significant differences in the phenotypes of males and females. Birds are a great example. So I've got this picture. Here's a male cardinal versus a female cardinal. So why do they look different? Well, it's because of the reason we talked about here. Females are choosing males in part based on their ability to sing and how pretty they look, having bright colors, being symmetrical. That's how females choose which male is worth mating with. Males aren't really selecting the females based on what they look like. They're willing to mate with whatever female is available because the males are investing less resources in the reproductive process. So females have to be choosy, males don't. And so therefore intersexual selection has selected for males to have bright colors and for females to actually have muted colors, and instead natural selection has selected for females to be camouflaged so they can sit on the nest and hopefully not get eaten by a predator. How can sexual selection violate Hardy-Weinberg? Well, it's the same way that natural selection affected Hardy-Weinberg. So sexual selection leads to different phenotypes surviving and reproducing at different rates. So it violates principle number 4. All right, and then the last one is, whoa, sorry, wow. whatever. The last one is um, a violation of Hardy-Weinberg number 5. So, gosh, sorry to do this. Sorry. So sorry. Sorry. Going back. Hardy-Weinberg, individuals mate randomly with other members of the population. So in other words, to achieve genetic equilibrium, mating has to be random. All right. So sexual selection would actually also violate this one because it means that individuals aren't mating randomly. They're selecting mates based on particular traits. And going back, so sorry to flip through all this. It turns out that most animals do mate non-randomly. In other words, a lot of animals, especially your higher, more complex animals, select a mating partner based on particular traits that they have. Inbreeding is a type of non-random mating where genetically related individuals mate with each other. So this might be a plant self-fertilizing or animals, especially in that are in small groups, breeding with each other, or even in yeah, okay, so organisms that live in small and relatively closed populations often mate with related individuals. And so because closely related individuals often carry the same alleles, inbreeding usually changes allele frequencies in a particular direction. So it often increases the frequency of homozygous genotypes and decreases the frequency of heterozygotes. So just breeding with like individuals can change your allele frequencies, and that will violate Hardy-Weinberg principle number 5. So hopefully you have a better understanding of what Hardy-Weinberg is. It's just a model that allows us to kind of ask the right questions about how and why a population is evolving, and it allows us to study these 5 different mechanisms of evolutionary change. And then wrapping things up, sometimes, let's just go to the second one. Sometimes heterozygotes can preserve recessive alleles. So I tell you what, now let's just skip this. Let's just go to this. Natural selection can maintain balanced polymorphisms. So you know what a polymorphism is. Sometimes natural selection just keeps different polymorphisms in balance. The book defines a balanced polymorphism as where where 2 or more phenotypes are maintained in stable proportions over many generations. And so what's happening is natural selection is preserving balanced polymorphisms when heterozygotes have higher relative fitness. So in other words, if a heterozygote has greater fitness than homozygotes, then the heterozygotes are going to be selected for by natural selection, and therefore they're going to keep more heterozygotes around, and when the heterozygotes breed, they're going to create individuals that are homozygous dominant, heterozygous, and homozygous recessive. So in other words, natural selection, by selecting for the superior heterozygotes, they're going to make sure that there are still heterozygotes and homozygotes in the population. All right, and this happens in cases where there's a heterozygote advantage. So heterozygote advantage is what it sounds like. It's when heterozygotes have higher relative fitness than homozygotes. And the best example of this, perhaps, is sickle cell anemia. So in sickle cell anemia, individuals that are heterozygotes produce red blood cells that help confer protection against malaria. And so in areas, I'm cutting a lot of corners here, but in places where there's a high incidence of malarial parasites, which you can see in the map here, that happens to be areas where, if you look at the DNA of those human populations, you have higher frequencies of the heterozygote genotype. Right? So natural selection, in this case, the pressures from the malarial parasite, help maintain a high frequency of heterozygotes, and when they have offspring, they're going to create homozygotes and heterozygote offspring, but natural selection is going to select for the heterozygote offspring because they have an advantage. All right, natural selection is going to change in different environments. So in other words, natural selection doesn't happen the same regardless of the environment. The example from the book is snails. So if you look at the chart, you can see on the x-axis we have striped shells. So what percent of the population has striped cells? And then the y-axis is what percent of the population has yellow shells. And so you can see that snails that live in hedges and fields, so places that have a lot of vegetation and bright light, are mostly striped and yellow. Whereas snails that live in wooded habitats where it's darker and it's more shaded and maybe the colors are more brown and black, then they tend to be less yellow and have a smaller percentage of stripes. So this snail population is going to be undergoing different types of natural selection just based on where the snails are living. Sometimes you have frequency-dependent selection. And so in frequency-dependent selection, the selective advantage of a phenotype depends on its frequency in the population. So let's talk about experiments done with these elderflower orchids. So with the orchids, yellow flowered plants and purple flowered plants produce equal numbers of flowers. And the pollinators alternate their visits between yellow flowers and purple flowers. However, research showed that bees tend to visit flowers that have a less frequent flower color at a higher rate than flowers that are common. So in other words, if you think of a field of, say, yellow flowers and a few purple flowers, the purple flowers are going to stick out more, and so the bees are going to go to the purple flowers more. So what's going to happen in that field over time? If the bees are going to the purple flowers more, then more purple flower alleles are going to get passed along. And so over time, your field of flowers might shift from purple being rare to purple becoming more common. But when that happens, yellow will become less common, and the bees are going to notice the yellow flowers more. So the bees will visit the yellow flowers, and the yellow alleles will get passed around. And so the population will oscillate back and forth from purple, mostly yellow, to mostly purple, and back to mostly purple. So that's just one example of how the frequency of a phenotype can affect selection. All right, and then an adaptive trait. An adaptive trait is any product of natural selection that increases the relative fitness of an organism in its environment. So sometimes we just say, look, if a trait is going to be advantageous, we call it an adaptive trait. And so over the course of evolution, through long periods of time, these adaptive traits are selected for. And so adaptation can be defined as the accumulation of adaptive traits over time. Right? And so it turns out that this isn't super straightforward. So in other words, we can say, look, when we look at an organism's traits, we can say, look, these all must be adaptive because natural selection has selected for them, and therefore these are helping the organism survive. And you can kind of come up with these stories for, why birds have wings or why fireflies glow or whatever. But it turns out that adaptations can kind of change. So in other words, a trait that is an adaptation, that's an adaptive trait, might benefit an organism in one way at one point during evolution, and then it might be used to benefit them in another way later on. So think of the evolution of birds from dinosaurs. So we know that dinosaurs had feathers long before they could fly. So how were feathers an adaptive trait initially? Well, the idea is that maybe feathers helped the dinosaurs attract mates. Maybe they're used in display or for camouflage. And so feathers were selected for initially not because dinosaurs were planning on taking to the skies one day, but rather that feathers would help them have greater fitness. And then over time, the feathers were selected for in a way that would allow them to fly. And so the adaptive trait, its benefits can kind of change over time. Sometimes traits are the product of chance events like genetic drifts. In other words, sometimes we look at organisms and the traits they have aren't through adaptation. It's just due to allele frequencies shifting randomly or due to chance events. And some traits are from basic physical laws. So if you think about seeds, right? Why does a particular plant, why does a mustard plant have small seeds? Is that an adaptation? Well, sure, but it's probably also due to the restraints of physical laws. In other words, a mustard plant isn't going to start growing giant seeds that weigh like a pound or something, because that would pull the plant over, and those seeds aren't going to float on the wind, or they're going to be harder to eat. And so physical laws place constraints on the evolutionary process, right? So in other words, just physics and the environment helps shape adaptations, right? So there's always going to be adaptive compromises in evolution. So, for example, sometimes there are competing selection pressures. So let's talk about sea turtles. So sea turtles swim in the ocean, but they breathe oxygen, so they have to come to the surface and they have to breathe. And this works out really well for them. So sea turtles, have been living in the oceans for a long time. However, when it comes to reproducing, since the offspring develop in eggs, they can't get enough oxygen if sea turtles were to lay their eggs underwater, and so sea turtles have to move on the land to bury their eggs in a nest in the sand. But sea turtles, they have adaptations that make them better swimmers. So that means they're not very good on land. And so a sea turtle has to kind of awkwardly crawl on land, and it's really laborious and risky to crawl onto the seashore, dig a nest in the sand with its flippers, and lay some eggs. So there's a compromise here that sea turtles need to be seaworthy, and they need to have flippers that allow them to move in the water efficiently. But at the same time, they need to be able to move on land when they lay eggs and be efficient on land. So those two needs kind of push and pull in opposite directions. There's no perfect adaptations. The environment changes over time. So anytime an organism is adapting to the environment is always changing, and so they have to always be adapting. And then there's also historical constraints. So in other words, organisms have inherited traits through evolution, and that's what they have to work with. So a common example here is how humans walk on two legs, and that works great. That's a good adaptation for us. So it frees up our hands to use tools and to carry things and so on. But our skeleton has basically been through most of evolution, human evolution, the evolution of humans' ancestors, our skeleton was adapted to walk around on all fours. And so walking around on two legs is fine, but we're kind of constrained. In other words, our spine and our muscles aren't still, and our feet and legs and knees and so on aren't quite they're still adapting to walking around on two legs. So the muscles and the bones and so on are constrained by the historical adaptations, the adaptations that let us walk on four legs, and now we're trying to use them to walk on two legs. All right, so I hope that made sense. If not, contact me, see the discussion board, and we can talk about this chapter in the Zoom meeting during lab time next Tuesday.